occupied what is today the Gaza Strip and who had disappeared from history by the end of the 8th century BC. So they went back 800 years and put the name of Palestina on the land to divorce it from any Jewish connection, and they changed the name of Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina. So, what is today Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza happens to be the same size as the state of Vermont. I use the state of Vermont because I happen to be from Vermont. How many of you here have been to Vermont? Excellent. Then you all know what a beautiful state Vermont is, particularly about the second week in October. And you can ride for very long distances in Vermont, and you will see lots of cows, the occasional quaint New England village, but you will not see very many people. The population of the entire state of Vermont is about 625 people. 625,000 people, sorry. Seems like 625, but it's 625,000. In 1850, the entire population of what is today Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza was about 200,000 people. But you don't need to take my word for it. This thing that you see in front of you came off the Palestinian Authority website in 1996. It was long since taken down, but nevertheless, it reflects the reality. As for the modern history of Palestine, especially during the Ottoman ruling period, the population of Palestine decreased and was estimated to 200,000 people. Think about that for a minute. What is today Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, in 1850 had 200,000 people. That is 1/3 the size of the number of people who live in Vermont today, and Vermont is virtually empty. It's as if the entire population of the land of Israel was contained in the city of Springfield, Massachusetts, and the rest of Massachusetts was entirely empty. So, in 1856, the Ottoman Empire promulgated a land registration law in which they demanded that anybody who owned property in Palestine had to register it. But people who owned property knew that if they actually signed up to that property, they'd have to pay taxes, and their sons would be drafted into the Ottoman Empire. So many of them signed land registry law forms that put the ownership title in the name of the Caliph, the ruler of the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul, or in the name of a very few large landowners. So remember the first two parts of what the Palestinian myth is. We were a settled people. No, you really weren't. There were very few of you living on our land. By 1856, the overwhelming majority of the residents of Palestine lost title to their land. It wasn't stolen by the Zionists. They gave it up in 1856. In 1917, the British issued the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration says, His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a Jewish national home. It was on the basis of the Balfour Declaration that the British were given control of the mandate for Palestine under the League of Nations. Take a look at what the Palestine mandate looked like in 1921 when the British took it over. It included not only that which is all of the land of Israel, not only all of that which is today Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, but all of that which is today Jordan, and for good measure, the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights, the British ceded to the French in 1922, and in 1923, they lopped off Transjordan to Jewish settlement and created the Emirate of Transjordan. Why? Because the family that was ruling in what became Saudi Arabia, in the Arabian Peninsula, the rulers of Mecca and Medina, were thrown out by the Saudis. And the British believed they owed them a favor because they helped to lead the Arab revolt against the Turks in World War I. And the British took the two sons of the last Hashemite ruler over the Hejaz, the Arabian Peninsula, created the Emirate of Transjordan for one, and gave the other brother the Kingdom of Iraq. But in so doing, they lopped off 2/3 of Palestine to Jewish settlement. In 1923, the mandate called for the British to lead Palestine towards ultimate independence. And so the British went to the Jewish community in Palestine and said, we want to create an agency to help foster self-government. And that was the birth of, and they said, we want to create a Jewish agency. And that's why the Jewish agency is called the Jewish Agency. And they went to the Arab community in Palestine and said the same thing. We want to create an Arab agency. And the Arab leadership said, no, we don't want it. Why? Because they felt that if they recognized an Arab agency, they would be granting legitimacy to a Jewish agency. You are all familiar with what Abba Eban once said, that the Palestinians have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. This is one of the first chances when they missed an opportunity to create an Arab agency. Jews continued to settle in the land of Israel, and the British put increasingly strict limits on Jewish immigration into the land of Israel because they did not want to upset the Arabs. Ultimately, whatever philo-Zionism may have occurred in Britain during World War I and thereafter, once they took over the mandate, they looked around the Middle East and said, boy, there are a lot more Arabs than there are Jews. And the Arabs have oil. And so they began to really restrict Jewish immigration. Nevertheless, in the middle of the 1930s, you had lots of Jews getting out of Germany and coming to Palestine, seeking escape from Hitler. And in 1936, the Arab community in Palestine revolted and issued in a period of 3 years of civil unrest. It was, in many ways, the first intifada. And what's interesting about this period of time, because that has direct relevance for what we're going to get to in a minute, the leadership of the Arab community in Palestine, by the way, none of them thought of themselves as quote-unquote Palestinians at this point. There was no Palestinian national movement. To the extent that they identified in national terms, it was either as pan-Arab nationalism or more locally as they considered themselves part of southern Syria. But what happened was the elite amongst the Arab community in Palestine left the unpleasantness. They went to Cairo, they went to Beirut, they went to Damascus, and sat out the period of civil unrest until it finally quieted down in 1939, and they came back. We all know what happened in the years that followed. Ultimately, after World War II, the British decided to end their responsibility for mandatory Palestine. The United Nations set up a special committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, that recommended partition of Palestine. And the United Nations General Assembly voted in November of 1947 on a resolution to partition Palestine, and this is important, these are the words of the resolution, to partition Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Jewish community in Palestine immediately accepted it, and the Arab community in Palestine immediately rejected it. But look at the partition lines. Had the Arab community accepted it in 1947, the dark orange lines would have been what became Israel. And there were two junctures between the coast and the Galilee where it is a narrow cross point, and then between south of Tel Aviv and the Negev where it was another small choke point that could easily have split the country into three. That happened on November 29th, 1947. On November 30th, 1947, there were armed skirmishes led by Arab fighting forces against Jewish communities up and down the length of Palestine. For a month, the only thing the Jewish community did was to respond defensively, because they hoped that the Arabs would come to their senses and accept the partition resolution. It wasn't until January of 1948 that Jewish forces actually went on the offensive to protect themselves. The British High Commissioner for Palestine, a man named Alan Cunningham, wrote a diplomatic cable back to London in January of 1948, in which he talked about the flight of Arabs from Palestine. Who fled? Initially, it was the same intellectual wellspring, the elite of Palestinian society, fled and went voluntarily to Damascus, Beirut, Cairo, to sit it out until the Arabs threw the Jews into the sea, and then they would come back. This was an entirely voluntary flight on their part. By the end of the Israeli War of Independence, of the some 800,000 Arabs living in what became Israel, about 650,000 of them had fled. Almost entirely voluntarily. There were two places in which Jewish forces, for strategic reasons, moved the Arab population down the road a piece. It was in the lower Galilee. You'll see an arrow from the Galilee into the West Bank. And from Ramlah and Lida, into the West Bank. Of the 650,000 Arabs who fled what became Israel, almost 2/3 of them fled from one part of Palestine into another part of Palestine, which is to say they lost a hometown, but not a homeland. One second. At the same time as 650,000 Arabs fled what became Israel, about 800,000 to 900,000 Jews were kicked out of Arab countries, forced to flee with nothing. And all of them fled with what they could only carry with them, and a great majority of them came into what became the Jewish state of Palestine. A very small state in the midst of a war. And those people who came were immediately made citizens and were housed and became productive members of the state of Israel. In Algeria, there were 160,000 Jews in 1947. Today, there are less than 100. In Iraq, there were 150,000. Today, there are less than 100. In Libya, there were 60,000. Today, there are none. In Egypt, there were 75,000. Today, it's a handful. In Tunisia, 100,000, and today, 1,500. The only community in which there are more than a couple thousand Jews is Morocco, where there are about 5,500 Jews, but their population was 350,000 Jews before the war. So this one tiny little country absorbed all of these people who, by the way, were not Ashkenazic Eastern European Jews. They didn't speak Yiddish and they didn't speak Hebrew. Were brought into Israel, became productive citizens, learned the language. Compare that to what happened with the Palestinian refugees. The Palestinian refugees fled not into some kind of alien territory. They fled mostly into the West Bank and Gaza, or into Jordan, Egypt, Syria, and Lebanon, which is to say they fled into an area where the population spoke the same language, had the same history, the same culture, and the same religion. When you think about all of the refugee displacement at the end of World War II, there were 40 million refugees at the end of World War II. And all of them were ultimately resettled and dealt with, and the problems solved, except for the Palestinian problem, the Palestinian refugee problem. Despite the fact that this should have been the easiest refugee problem to solve, all of the Arab states forced Palestinians into camps. If you were a Palestinian Arab who fled from what was Palestine into Lebanon in 1948, and you married a Lebanese woman, and you now have children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, all of whom were born in Lebanon, none of them are allowed to be Lebanese citizens. None of them are allowed to own land in Lebanon. None of them are allowed to send their kids to Lebanese schools. They are kept in wretched Palestinian refugee camps administered by the United Nations. My grandfather fled Tsarist Russia in the early part of the 20th century, came to America as a refugee, became a citizen, an immigrant, and stopped being a refugee. That is true for every refugee population in the world, save one: Palestinian refugees. The United Nations has a special definition for Palestinian refugees. It isn't only that generation that were refugees, it is their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren throughout the generations. Refugee status passes from parent to child. That is not true for any other refugee population in the world. If you were a Palestinian Arab and you came to America in 1948, and you took out American citizenship, and your children were naturally born Americans, and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren are still considered Palestinian refugees. It doesn't exist for any other population group. You see before you the borders of Israel between 1949 and 1967. They were armistice lines. The agreements that Israel signed with its neighbors in 1949 weren't supposed to be permanent borders. They were supposed to lead to immediate negotiations to determine permanent borders, and all of the Arab states refused to accept it. Jordan took over the West Bank and annexed it to Jordan. Egypt administered the Gaza Strip. Between 1949 and 1967, no one no one talked about a Palestinian state. It was only after the Six-Day War that that occurred. You see here Moshe Dayan actually negotiating the armistice agreements in 1949. Instead, the Arab states surrounding Israel maintained a state of war with Israel. There was no talk of a Palestinian state, but Israel was subject to terrorism. Finally, after all kinds of raids from the Gaza Strip into Israel, Israel invaded the Sinai Peninsula in 1956, and along with the British and the French, made their way to the Suez Canal. The British and the French did this because they had owned the Suez Canal, and Nasser, the president of Egypt, nationalized it. But Eisenhower, who couldn't do anything about the Soviet invasion of Hungary at the same time in October of 1956, took it out on the Israelis and forced them to withdraw from the Sinai. Instead of demanding that Egypt actually make peace with Israel for the price of Israeli withdrawal, Israel had to withdraw unilaterally, and Eisenhower said, all right, we will put United Nations peacekeeping troops into Sinai. And in May of 1967, the Egyptians blockaded the Straits of Tiran, which allowed access to the Israeli port of Eilat. A blockade, by the way, is an act of war. Not that they needed to declare an act of war, since there had been an active declaration of war since 1948. And they massed hundreds of thousands of troops into Sinai. Israel responded by taking its largely civilian reservist army and calling men out of the civilian economy back into reserve units in the military. And for 3 weeks, Israel did nothing, hoping that the United Nations would stop both the Syrians who had massed on the Golan Heights and the Egyptians. And the United Nations did nothing. The United States did nothing. And finally, on the morning of June 6, 1967, Israel launched an air attack on the Egyptian military. And they caught the entire Egyptian Air Force on the ground on their bases and destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. We had sent word on behalf of Israel. The United States sent word to King Hussein of Jordan, telling him, the Israelis told us that if you don't get involved in this war, the Israelis will not get involved on the West Bank. Please stay out of it, and nothing will change with your border. So King Hussein calls Nasser of Egypt and says, how's it going? And meanwhile, he's hearing all of these planes coming from Egypt, thinking they were Egyptian planes. And Nasser tells him it's going great. And King Hussein opens up a second front and starts shelling Jerusalem from East Jerusalem, starts shelling West Jerusalem from East Jerusalem on all of these hilltops where there were Jordanian army positions into the Jewish part of Jerusalem. And as a result, Israel attacked, conquered the West Bank, and reunited the divided city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is an ancient city. It was a city that King David made the capital of Israel 3,000 years ago. And in that entire period of time, the city of Jerusalem was divided for 19 years, between 1949 and 1967. When you hear the term traditional Arab East Jerusalem, it's nonsense. In the year 1850, I'm going to do this, although I think I know the answer. How many of you have been to Israel? Raise your hand. Thank you. So where the King David Hotel sits in the city of Jerusalem was not in the city of Jerusalem in 1850. It was outside the city. The only part of the city was inside the old city walls. And the only reason that people began to settle outside the old city walls was because the Jewish community, which was a strong majority even in 1850, ran out of room and started settling outside the walls. How many of you have been to Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus? Guess what? That's Arab East Jerusalem. Hebrew University was first started in quote-unquote Arab East Jerusalem. The only time that that area was Arab East Jerusalem was between 1949 and 1967. But, what, pardon me? I can't hear you. Well, Mount Scopus remained under Israeli jurisdiction, and every week they would send a convoy up into Mount Scopus. After the Six-Day War, Israel went to the United Nations. Abba Eban went to the United Nations and said in a speech I will remember for the rest of my life, I remember watching it at the time, Israel has no territorial ambition. Israel is prepared to give it all back in exchange for real peace. And instead, the Arab states met, the Arab League met in Khartoum later that year and came out with 3 no's. No negotiations with Israel, no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel. And for the first time, you began to see the rise of specific Palestinian terror. The Palestine Liberation Organization was formed in 1964 to liberate Palestine. And by the way, that didn't mean the West Bank and Gaza, because those were under Arab rule then. When they were talking in 1964 about the liberation of Palestine, they were talking about Israel. And this ultimately led to the Yom Kippur War in 1973. The 1973 war, you had, in the prelude to that, 3 times in 1973, the Egyptians mobilized their army, and the Syrians mobilized their army. And the Israelis took all of their men out of the civilian economy at incredible cost, and each time the Egyptians and the Syrians did nothing. And finally, the Israelis see again, on Erev Yom Kippur, on the eve of Yom Kippur, that the Egyptians and the Syrians were doing it again. And they made a political decision. You know what? It's another false move. We're not going to mobilize our troops on Yom Kippur. If we need to, we'll deal with it later. And as we all know, the Egyptians and the Syrians attacked on Yom Kippur and essentially caught Israel at a moment in which they were not prepared. And the Syrians very quickly made their way almost into Israel on the Golan Heights. And the Egyptians crossed the canal and made their way into Sinai. And it took 2 bloody weeks of Israeli fighting and American rearmament of Israel. We were loading planes 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This is a decision made by then President Nixon to rearm Israel, to make sure it wouldn't run out. And as Ariel Sharon was about to defeat the Egyptian 7th Army on the other side of the canal, on the Israeli side of the canal, Henry Kissinger said, "Don't. Let's get to a ceasefire with the Egyptians in place so that they can claim some modicum of victory that might lead to a peace process." And the Israelis desisted. And that led to, ultimately, Camp David, the first Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. This was a move entirely the result of Jimmy Carter. Because in 1977, Jimmy Carter had the great idea, the Egyptians having thrown the Russians out of Egypt and turned to America. Carter had the great idea, we're going to reconvene the Geneva Conference and bring the Russians back in as the co-chairs of the Geneva Conference. And Sadat went ballistic. So that's the last thing we need. And instead went on 60 Minutes and said he's prepared to go to Jerusalem. And did so. I was actually a graduate student at the time doing dissertation research in Israel when he came. And I remember the polls in Israel before then. 2 weeks before Sadat came, 75% of Israelis were opposed to any Israeli withdrawal from Sinai. It provided this incredible strategic depth. He went to the Knesset. He said, I want to think about this. He went to the bowels of the enemy, to the very Knesset, and made a speech talking about peace. And 2 weeks after he made that speech, 75% of the Israelis were convinced they could give up Sinai. It led to the first Israeli-Egyptian peace, for which Sadat paid a very dear price. And Egypt was ostracized throughout the Arab world. The Palestinians, in the late 80s, begin a period of civil unrest in the West Bank and Gaza that became known as the intifada. Israel tried to suppress it, and eventually did, but it made Israel very uncomfortable. I was on a kibbutz in 1971. The kibbutz fields ended in the West Bank town of Qalqilia. It is where Israel is 9 miles wide. It is where there was a Jordanian army position from which they could easily fire artillery into Tel Aviv. You could see Tel Aviv down the road. Israel was 9 miles wide, and it obviously was an area, if you could get the 9 miles, you could split Israel in half. And in 1971, there was absolutely no border. We used to walk into Qalqilia every night for coffee, and Palestinians would come into Israel and work. But if you are coming into Israel to set off suicide bombs, it becomes an entirely different matter. This ultimately led to negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, the PLO. Remember, the PLO, as a result of the Iraq War, the fall of the Soviet Union, had been completely marginalized in the Arab world. They were in Tunis. But Rabin and Peres were looking for a way to get out of this. They were looking for a way to see whether it was finally possible that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict wouldn't be defined as a zero-sum game, that you could define it in ways in which both sides could portray to their children a better future. And as a result, you got the Oslo peace process. And in September 1993, there was an exchange of letters between Arafat and Rabin, in which Arafat, on behalf of the PLO, recognized the right of Israel to exist, renounced terror and violence, and dedicated the PLO to putting down anyone who would raise terrorism against Israel. And Israel recognized the Palestine Liberation Organization as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian peace, of the Palestinian people, and began to negotiate a peace agreement with Arafat that started on the White House lawns on September 13th, 1993. Ultimately leading to Camp David in the summer of 2000. For 2 weeks, then Prime Minister Barak, President Clinton, and Chairman Arafat negotiated, which essentially meant that the Israelis and the Americans would have discussions amongst themselves. And they would go to the Palestinians, and whatever Palestinians below Arafat were prepared to negotiate, Arafat would shut them down. And Arafat would say, we've made our historic compromise, we make no more. and at one point goes to Clinton and says, the Jews have no right anywhere in the city of Jerusalem. There was no Jewish temple in Jerusalem. And Clinton looks at him and says, what are you talking about? I am a Christian, and I believe there was a Jewish temple in Jerusalem, because that's where Jesus went the week before he died. And you know why Arafat said that? Because the Samaritans, an offshoot of the Israelites, had their temple at Mount Gerizim in the West Bank. And he said that was the Jewish temple. And ultimately, Arafat's unwillingness to budge at all led to the end of Camp David. And you had Dennis Ross, the chief American negotiator at the time, write in his book, Alas, Arafat was not up to peacemaking. After the meeting with President Clinton, it was clear he was not up to ending the conflict, and he had already effectively rejected the president's ideas. But nevertheless, the negotiations continued, the discussions continued, such that by the end of the year 2000, Clinton set forward a series of parameters. Let's go back. In which he said, here are the parameters for a final peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. Israel would cede all of Gaza, 96% of the West Bank, trade territory inside Israel for the territory that Israel would keep from the West Bank. That Jerusalem would be solved by the principle that which is Jewish in Jerusalem would be under Israeli sovereignty, that which was Arab would be under Palestinian sovereignty, with some kind of joint condominium over the Holy Basin. That Israel would recognize a demilitarized Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital. That Israel would recognize the unlimited right of Palestinian refugees to return to an independent Palestinian state, not to Israel. And the government of Israel said yes. And Arafat said no. And when, in fact, Arafat said no to that, and Bush then succeeded Clinton, Bush was roundly criticized for not keeping the peace process going. Bush looked at this and said, where am I supposed to go? If that's the offer that was on the table and Arafat rejected it, where am I supposed to go? But nevertheless, did revive it and sent all kinds of missions to try to revive it. Because you'll remember what happened was the second intifada, where suicide bombing after suicide bombing was occurring. In the month of March 2002, 130 civilian Israelis lost their lives to suicide bombs, including the Arab Passover massacre at the Park Hotel in Netanya. It was only then that the government of Israel decided to build a security barrier. And they decided to build a security barrier for only one reason: to stop terrorists from coming in and blowing up innocent Israeli civilians. When you hear about the quote-unquote apartheid wall, I actually have a one-word response to that, the first syllable of which is bull. If Israel had wanted an apartheid wall, they could have built it at any point from 1967 to 2002. They only began to build it when Israelis were being blown up by Palestinian suicide bombers. No applause. I'm not doing this it's an important point. As a matter of fact, Ariel Sharon, who decided to do this, was ideologically opposed to it, because he wanted no divisions in the land of Israel. But necessity required it. In Gaza, Hamas grew stronger and stronger and ultimately took over Gaza. So you now had a division between the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, controlling the West Bank, and Gaza under the control of Hamas, leading ultimately to Sharon deciding to totally evacuate Israel out of Gaza. There were some 8,000 Israeli settlers in Gaza, all of whom were there because the Israeli government said, we need to settle there. Various Israeli governments. But it was actually requiring more than 20,000 Israeli troops in Gaza to protect those 8,000. And Sharon made the decision saying, you know what? If we ever get to a final deal, we're not going to keep this anyway. And unilaterally pulled out of Gaza. About 80% of all of the flowers that Israel was exporting to Europe, a huge market, were coming from greenhouses in Gaza. And Sharon left them all intact in the hopes that they would be taken over by Palestinians and run by Palestinians. His hope was that by withdrawing finally and giving Palestinians a territory that they would exclusively control, that they could set up governance that would demonstrate their ability to run a country. Within 2 hours of the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, all of the greenhouses in Gaza had been destroyed. In 2007, the fall of 2007, Bush revives the peace process, starting in Annapolis, down the road. And for a year, there are negotiations. Then Prime Minister Olmert, in September of 2008, goes to a boss, not Arafat anymore, a boss, and says, here's the deal. We're already out of Gaza. We will only retain the very minimum amount of West Bank territory that has settlement that is built up close to the Green Line, close to pre-1967 Israel. It was going to be about 4% of the West Bank. We will trade 4% of Israel, equal territory, to make up for every square inch that we take from the West Bank. We will share Jerusalem. We will recognize you as an independent state. And as a matter of fact, if you say yes to this, you and I will go arm in arm to the United Nations. We will recognize the right of Palestinian Arab refugees to return to your state. And I am prepared to take thousands of Palestinians back into Israel. What do you say? And for 3 months, Abbas said nothing, did not respond. And in December 2008, you had the war in Lebanon and in Gaza. And that was another historic opportunity to make peace that was unfortunately not met. And in 2009, we have a new administration in America, and we have a new government in Israel under Bibi Netanyahu. And the new president doesn't take up where Olmert and Abbas had left off. Not at all. Instead, he goes to Cairo in June of 2009 and makes a speech about American willingness to reach out to the Muslim world. And he says some very nice things. He tells his Arab audience, and this was broadcast throughout the Arab world, that they need to recognize Israel, that they need to come to terms with the reality of Israel, that those people who deny that reality deny history. And he justifies the existence of Israel based on the Holocaust. Well, you know what? That was feeding into Arab mythology, which is, you know, the Jews were treated terribly in Europe, and ultimately the Europeans dumped their Jewish problem on us. And it is as if that was the only reason the Jews had any connection to the land of Israel, simply because the Europeans dumped them on the poor Arab world, and it ignored 3,000 years of Jewish history. And then he demanded a public acknowledgement that Israel stop building settlements. Here's an important fact. The way you read about settlements, you might think that they have so gobbled up the West Bank that there's nothing left to negotiate. The entirety of the built-up area of settlements, of Jewish settlements on the West Bank, constitutes 5% of the territory of the West Bank. That's it. And most large settlements, and they aren't settlements, they're communities. Anybody who's been to Ma'ale Adumim realizes that's a city. That ain't a settlement. Knows that it's a very small area of the West Bank. And since most 80% of the settlers live very close to the Green Line, it's a matter of how you would draw a very squiggly border. But the propaganda about settlements is so huge. And even today, when you read of new settlements, there are no new settlements. Israel isn't establishing new settlements. The only thing that Israel is doing is building up, not out. They are not expropriating another inch of land in the West Bank. They are simply building up in settlements that are consensus settlements, those settlements that everyone recognizes will be part of Israel, and they're building up, not out. It has virtually no relevance for ultimately coming up with a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. But part of the response to all of this has not been, until very recently, to sit down and actually negotiate peace. It has been to go after Israel and seek its delegitimization. It has been to go after Israel and seek recognition of a Palestinian state in international fora, and agencies of the UN, etc. You know what? They can do that from today until tomorrow, and it's not going to get rid of a single Israeli soldier on the West Bank. The only way that will occur are through direct negotiations between Israel and Palestine. Now go back with me to the origin myth of the Palestinians. We were a settled people. No, we were actually very few in number, living on our land. No, by the time the Zionist movement started, you had already lost your land. When an alien people, I'm sorry, I'm not prepared to go into the notion that the Jews are an alien people in the land of Israel. Supported by the colonial powers. Yeah, with the kind of support that the British were giving the Zionists in Palestine, it's amazing Israel ever got established. Stole our land. No, you had lost us. And expelled us. No, overwhelmingly you fled of your own accord. Because, by the way, when there is bloodshed and violence and guns, people around the world flee. 3 million people fled the Swat Valley in Pakistan because there was a lot of shooting going on. It happens everywhere where there is shooting going on. People flee. I have no doubt that